Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously, by Olúfemi Táíwò. Narrated by Amir, Abdullah. Preface. It was only as I finished writing this book that it occurred to me that it might be useful to situate it in the broader context of my ongoing research. I hope that this helps my audience to appreciate the much larger set of challenges that face scholarship on Africa, towards the illumination of which my book is a modest contribution. I'm one of the few scholars from the continent who still argues in favor of the relevance of the so-called Enlightenment Project to the advancement of Africa and the progress of its peoples. I have already argued my case in a no-holds-barred, full-throated defense of modernity and why it offers Africa the most promising path for getting out of the misery corner of the globe. This book was Africa Must Be Modern, a manifesto, and it was originally published by design in Nigeria, because I hoped to reach an audience of young, educated, though not necessarily university-educated, Africans. My research has led me to believe that if colonialism had not preempted modernity in Africa, and turned it into an object of revulsion for most African intellectuals, a lot of what many people think is wrong with the continent today may have been averted. My work on philosophy and the history of ideas has left me troubled by the persistent but erroneous belief of many African scholars that modernity is a European, Western, or white artifact. While I continue to fight against this misconception, unfortunately, anti-modernity scholars have rarely considered it worth their while to engage with the alternative point of view. But this is not the main problem. The issue is that the literature which came out of these historical errors continues to be dominant in scholarship about the continent by both Africans and non-Africans today. It is within this context that I originally wrote the paper which has become the present book. Because modernity is conflated with Westernism and with whiteness, and all three with colonialism, decolonization, the negation of colonialism, has become a catch-all idea to tackle anything with any, even minor association with the West. This is not only problematic as a matter of theory and history, but it is incorrect, too. Because subscribers to this all-encompassing decolonization pay no mind to those of us who argue for the oneness of humanity and against the racialization of modernity, I prefer to leave them to their designs. Instead, this book is addressed to those who seek or can be persuaded to consider alternative paths to making sense of reality. As the Yoruba saying goes, there are many roads that enter a market. I offer this book as one road to improving our understanding of Africa's position in the world of ideas and events. To this end, Against Decolonization seeks to 1. Identify blind spots in current scholarship and direct our attention to how they might be redressed, and 2. Show how and why those alternative paths may actually lead to more insights than the existing dominant orientations. In doing so, I call attention to themes, thinkers, ideas, movements, programs, and writings which are hardly ever referenced in discussions on decolonization. My hope is that expanding our horizons in this way may lead to more robust and, importantly, more accurate explanations of the challenges facing contemporary Africa. I address Against Decolonization to people who are still unsure about the worth of the decolonizing trope, and who can use my intervention to help them make a productive decision. To people who already embrace decolonization because everybody does, and no one has yet to show them where it may be wrong, so that they can work out if they truly agree. And to others, especially students and young scholars, who may be uncomfortable with the indiscriminate application of this idea to all aspects of life, but don't yet feel informed enough to take it on. I limit myself in this work to discussing decolonization and have refrained from addressing the different concept of decoloniality. This is for the simple reason that while the term decoloniality has its roots in a particular movement in philosophy centered around Latin America, as a philosopher myself, I remain unimpressed about its claims and what it really adds to our understanding. Decoloniality, as anthropologist Arjun Appadurai explains, is not a successor to colonialism and coloniality. Instead, it offers an alternative, one that is rooted in indigenous thought and practice about nature, community, and solidarity. But this alternative, as Appadurai assesses, and with which I agree, rests on a reversal of the historical impact of capitalism and colonialism. It seeks to return us to an earlier period of pre-colonial splendor, when what we need to imagine, as Achille Mbembe argues, is an alternative future. The dominant tendency on the part of many African scholars is to incorrectly make decolonization and decoloniality into synonyms. It is beyond the scope of this work to address this here, and it is something for those scholars themselves to justify. But it nonetheless speaks to my contention that the idea of decolonizing has lost its way. I hope that my book helps us do a better job of making sense of events, past and present, and generates a greater diversity of opinions and more and better scholarship designed to move humanity, not just African humanity, forward. Introduction. I would like to begin with an anecdote from when I was at high school in Ibadan, Nigeria, which I think illustrates the core problems that decolonizing philosophy was meant to solve. A contingent of students from another high school in Cotonou, Dahomey, now Benin, had come to our city for a 7-day trip, lodging with us in our dormitories at my boarding school. For the week we were all together, my schoolmates and I spent our time trying to practice our French language skills, while the students from Cotonou did the same with their English. It was not till the eve of their departure that we all discovered, doubtless to our chagrin, that they were all mostly Yoruba. That is, we could have had more meaningful, even deeper conversations in our shared original tongue and primary culture. It was not until 1985, at a conference in Toronto, Canada, held to mark the centenary of the infamous Berlin West Africa Conference of 1884 to 1885, that this experience came back to me, and I was able to expand on it in a presentation entitled On the Political Implications of Geography. It was almost an epiphany when I realized that long before any one of us students in Ibadan or Cotonou had been born, our future mindsets had already been laid out. Our preferences, from victuals, bread, le pain, and beer, le vin, to colonial capitals, London, Paris, to philosophical orientations, empiricism, phenomenology, had already been rigged in ways that we must, late into advanced adulthood, seek to undo. So, when Ngugi wa Thiong'o argues for the centrality of language in the task of decolonizing the mind, I can't say there is much room for disagreement. And when Kwasi Wirdu insisted that how we think philosophically is influenced by the language in which we learn to do philosophy, one might not object too strongly to that either. Just as Ngugi reports that during his school days in Kenya, the pupils were discouraged, on pain of corporal punishment, from speaking their indigenous languages, and Wirdu's experience during a similar period was not that different in Ghana, I can tell many comparable stories from my own much later childhood in Nigeria. The schizophrenia-like condition brought about by going to school in one language and leading our non-school lives in another is one we'll carry with us forever. Although I do not do so in this book, it's possible to trace a direct causal line from these chaotic linguistic phenomena to some of the contemporary difficulties of much of African knowledge production. It's the reason many African scholars assume that our original languages are good only for colloquial conversations and fall short of the requirements of deep thinking. Even in religious practice, especially liturgies, the domestication of Christianity has led in Pentecostal circles to colonial languages being the primary means of worship, with gaudy translations into our mother tongues provided almost for comic relief. The main assumption here is that anything that requires deep thought is the domain of our borrowed languages. Our mother tongues are good only for the everyday, for habits, or for ritual purposes. The latter accessible only to the limited few who are appropriately initiated. As a consequence, despite the current anxiety about our languages dying out, it may already be too late to save them from deepening fossilization, even while they still appear alive. More on this in due course. The drive to rescue future generations from this fate should be welcomed by everyone who understands its terrible implications for a coherent intellectual identity and for high-quality scholarship. Given what I just said, why do I then think that it may be time to discard the decolonization trope in philosophy and elsewhere? When I began this work, I was mainly setting out to rethink decolonization, and I could not have predicted what I end up offering here. As I wrote in the original essay that this longer work is based on, abandoning the trope of decolonization altogether was only a possibility. But I'm now convinced of the fruitlessness of extending the scope of decolonization beyond its original meaning. That is, of making a colony into a self-governing entity with its political and economic fortunes under its own direction, though not necessarily control, which I refer to in the book as decolonization. Decolonization today, however, has come to mean something entirely different. Forcing an ex-colony to forswear on pain of being forever under the yoke of colonization any and every cultural, political, intellectual, social, and linguistic artifact, idea, process, institution, and practice that retains even the slightest whiff of the colonial past. I call this decolonization. Decolonization presents itself in a number of ways. Any aspect of an ex-colony that mirrors what was there during the colonial period is treated as evidence of continuing colonization. Any institution that can be traced to colonial times must be shunned once colonization has supposedly ended. The ultimate nebulous claim is that decolonization is complete only after all forms of domination are overturned. In this way, decolonization is equated with human emancipation, and this is why some people speak of the myth of decolonization in Africa. It doesn't take too much effort to see how this way of thinking is flawed. In fact, no society, whether former colony or not, is anywhere near human emancipation. Setting this as a goal of decolonization can only stem from either a lack of understanding or from an ideological commitment. When these terms are conflated, the general objective of seeking human emancipation becomes an unfinished anti-colonial task. This is the conception that I attack in this work. As I argue, it is decolonization that has lost its way and is seriously harming scholarship in and on Africa. We should rid ourselves of decolonization because no significant good can come from expanding its reach into the broad domain of cultural studies, including political, social, and religious phenomena. Deploying the idea as an explanatory model, theoretical matrix, or descriptive mechanism for our choice of political arrangements, the religious forms that dominate our lives, or even the languages we speak in different contexts, results, at best, in unsatisfactory or uncompelling outcomes. At worst, it creates confusion and obscurantism, if not outright distortion and falsification. The concept of decolonization, accurately applied, describes the struggle for independence and its outcome, creating a sharp and clear division between one state and another, and aiding in our understanding. But if we extend its parameters beyond this, we are just chasing shadows and incorrectly identifying causality. My argument follows several key lines. First, the ubiquity of decolonization in all areas of thought, from literature, linguistics, and philosophy, to politics, economics, sociology, psychology, and medicine, indicates that either the idea packs an explanatory and/or analytical approach like no other, or it has simply become a catch-all trope, often used to perform contemporary morality or authenticity. I am convinced that the latter is increasingly the case. Second, I contend that many of the tasks decolonizing is supposed to help us with are already being or can be carried out without invoking this buzzword, and, I might add, without some of the histrionics that go with it. My hope is that my argument is compelling enough to persuade others to take a closer look at the real merits of the idea. Although the original inspiration for this book was philosophy, I'll go beyond this and dive into history and historiography, political theory, the politics of language, and the comparative experience of colonialism and its aftermath in Africa and the Caribbean. But the fundamental framework of the book remains philosophy. The listener should bear this in mind as we proceed, as it is the conceptual framing of decolonization which is chiefly responsible for the unclarity surrounding it. This book is not so much about what the proponents of decolonization get wrong. Such a focus would smack too much of finger-pointing, and would do little to advance understanding. In that regard, I won't be spending much time highlighting the weaknesses in the arguments of decolonization's leading lights. Given that the most enthusiastic decolonizers never give any thought to the case I'm making here, I think a more productive approach is simply to offer other ways of looking at the same phenomena, and to allow our respective listeners to choose which framework provides the best explanation of today's world. My aim in this book is more to shine a light on the omissions and blind spots of decolonization. I believe that addressing these areas will ultimately create a richer discourse with tighter arguments in favor of decolonization, or with good reasons for limiting its scope, modifying its formulation, or even abandoning it outright. My view is that the latter prospects are the ones which will most improve our knowledge and understanding. To be clear, I would like to see the trope abandoned in most areas, especially when it comes to making sense of phenomena in contemporary Africa. This is not because colonialism plays no role in explaining events, but because we must take care to specify in each case exactly how colonialism features in the explanation, and why a colonialism-driven explanation is better than the alternatives. As I argue, this procedure is rarely followed at present. I make the case for discarding decolonization in discussions on African philosophy, historiography, political science, the language we should do our scholarship in, and related areas, where it has been inserted without careful thought and in a way that actually hinders understanding. Although the proliferation of the decolonization trope has reached most, if not all, parts of the world, I argue that its pernicious influence and consequences are more exaggerated in African discourses, given the central place that many contemporary African thinkers assign to colonialism and its aftermath in the unfolding of ex-colonies. It is not surprising that the idea of decolonization has a significant attraction for these intellectuals. Despite appearances, this is not a fighting book. No doubt, it has a polemic ring to it, but its polemical thrust is not meant to shame or name names. Rather, it simply aims to identify errors, or better still, warn unsuspecting scholars of the dangers of merely deploying the most obvious analytical tools at their disposal, embracing the language of decolonizing as if it were unproblematic, and in doing so, writing the kinds of questionable analyses that this book challenges. Decolonize This is my way of capturing the challenge I present to those who embrace the decolonizing trope. I challenge them to show what is wrong with the work of those of us who have engaged critically with and sought to domesticate ideas from the West, like modernity, and even with ideas, processes, and institutions originating in colonialism as part of our common, I assume decolonizers share this goal, commitment to creating a better world for ourselves and our progeny. As I have said, I wish to offer new possibilities for those who may not be persuaded by the decolonization trope and identify the blind spots which characterize it. Needless to say, if it turns out that those blind spots are non-existent or less significant than I have made out, I will stand corrected and offer my apologies to my opponents. But if I thought that this was the case, it would be foolhardy to issue the challenge at the heart of this book. Throughout the book, I point to ways in which the ex-colonized, at least in some parts of Africa, have domesticated, and not merely by mimicry, many ideas, processes, institutions, and practices that are routinely attributed to colonialism, but are in fact traceable to modernity and other causes. And even if some of those phenomena were rooted in colonialism, that by itself is not enough to condemn them as evidence of the persistence of colonial forms of rule in the post-independence period. This facile attribution to colonial causation of many practices and processes comes from an absolutization of colonialism and its supposedly almost undefeatable capacity to bend the will of the colonized. Simultaneously, this approach denies or at least discounts the agency of the colonized. That is, it must and does foreclose the possibility that the colonized could find anything of worth in the life and thought of the colonizer, which they could repurpose for their own societies, both during and after colonialism. In fact, one of my motivations in writing this book was a nagging feeling that many of the creative works of the ex-colonized are either not being recognized or not being taken seriously by the zealots of decolonizing, insofar as their intellectual products or institutional practices could be considered tainted, even faintly, by the colonial experience. Worse still, due diligence is hardly ever done to establish within reasonable limits to what extent colonialism was a factor in the emergence of such products and practices. Decolonize this. A running theme among decolonizers is their unremitting opposition to and their overweening determination to locate any and every colonial hangover in a process, practice, or institution. The problem is that it's not enough to accommodate in our writings the contributions of scholars from the global South, because some of us already do this routinely without any reference to decolonizing. Decolonizing scholars cannot escape a Manichaean division in which, just as during colonial times, the colonized and the colonizers must occupy entirely different spaces, and, as the British saying goes, ne'er the twain shall meet. Any colonialism-tinged phenomena must be purged from the post-colonial world. Ato Seki Otu provides a good description of the problems inherent in this absolutization of colonialism, the accompanying repudiation of universalism, and the paradox that a Manichaean worldview generates. He contends that to abjure universalism tout court, because of imperialism, Eurocentric and discriminatory auspices of certain versions, as some Western conscripts to the anti-imperialism cause in common with certain voices from the global South invite us to do, is the last word of the imperial act. He continues, but such is the vicious paradox of some critiques of universalism from Africa and the global South, their obsessive compulsive Eurocentrism, their willful captivity to the very discourse they are avowedly sworn to divulge and dethrone, their exclusive preoccupation with the things the West does with words in order to enforce its particulars as universals, their trained habit, in contrast, of being utterly incurious regarding what our grandmothers do with words of evaluative judgment that have universals for their predicates. It is as if purveyors of Eurocentrism and their critics drink from the same cup and end up inebriated in separate beds, but with kindred distractions. That must be the reason why universalism is chief among those ritual anathemas of anti-imperialism, or, as they say, counter-hegemonic discourse. My hope is that Seki Otu's caution and my own efforts to bring into the discussion the products of the genius of African agency in claiming the universal against the false universalism of colonialist ideologies will enable others to see what decolonization regularly obscures. In this book, I wish to present to our decolonizing scholars and their audience evidence of how indigenous genius has taken hold of and turned to their own purposes various material and ideational artifacts that were part of their lives before, during, and after colonialism. Some of them, doubtless, either originated in colonialism or were introduced into their lives during the colonial period, without it necessarily following that these ideas or objects were constitutive parts of the colonial infrastructure. In the following chapters, I challenge our decolonizers to show us why we should decolonize beyond the need to broaden our repertoire or take seriously the works of thinkers outside of the Euro-American canon, which many already do without subscribing to the idea of decolonization, and to consider what the consequences of decolonizing the phenomena I accuse them of ignoring or sidestepping would be. This would be instead of the current preference of our decolonizers for talking in nebulous terms, forever bashing the same Euro-American thinkers for excluding native African scholars' production, even as they themselves have never considered the complexity of the work of African authors, and thereby repeat the same errors as their supposed opponents. Let's pause for a moment to anticipate the sort of things we'd like our decolonizing theorists to try their hands at decolonizing. I give two examples, one from music and the other from a combination of music and literature. The year was either 1984 or 1985. A fellow graduate student at the University of Toronto, not an African, had asked me if I was at the concert. "What concert?" I asked. "The performance by King Sunny Ade and his new African beats," he replied. I was not there, but I am sure now that neither he nor I could have guessed what the consequence of his effusive praise for the maestro's performance would be for me. I was a fan of Sunny Ade from my preteen years, when he emerged on the music scene in Nigeria, and I had already seen him perform a few times, both live and on television. And in those days I was not always keen on going to performances by groups I already knew. Then my friend proceeded to regale me with his account of all the things that impressed him about Sunny Ade and his concert. It went along the following lines. Sunny Ade's was a roughly 30-piece band, playing instruments, singing and dancing all at the same time, and doing so with such tightness and discipline in the arrangements that nothing was astray. That was when it suddenly struck me that for people in North America to see that kind of complex, multifaceted performance, they would, for the most part, have to go to a concert hall, to the opera, or to see a choir. Each of these performances would likely have a conductor and sheet music for the players. That was when I realized how little we valued the accomplishments of our Sunny Ades and Ebenezer Obeys, the other maestro, who have jointly dominated Nigeria's music scene for half a century. They, with no formal training and largely self-taught on the instrument they play as leaders of their respective bands, the guitar, have put together complex pieces of music with a creative mixture of indigenous and other instrumentation that is alien to their culture, from electric guitars to accordions, trap drums to Hawaiian guitar, and the organ to wind instruments. I have not looked at Sunny Ade the same way since. Juju, the genre within which Sunny Ade excels, has its roots in Yoruba civilization, but it emerged within the modern performance subculture that began with the proliferation of Christianity in West Africa from the early 19th century. Unlike other genres in Yoruba music, which hew more closely to their roots, Juju has at its core musical instruments of foreign provenance. As we shall hear in the coming chapters, the non-African origins of these instruments are, problematically, and possibly even wrongly, often identified with colonialism. In this way, Juju is unlike genres like Sakara, Apala, Itieri, Dundun, and Shekeri, and Lukigori, all members of the Yoruba performance family, and almost all, except for electronic recording and amplification, incorporating nothing even remotely related to the former colonial powers. Before we draw any implications from Juju music and its challenge to the decolonization trope, I want to bring to the discussion another event involving music, which I believe challenges the relevance of decolonization to creating theories and explanatory models. For some inexplicable reasons, the proponents of decolonizing, who enjoy knocking Leopold Sedar Senghor and Chinua Achebe, for writing in colonial languages have never seemed as eager to excoriate Wole Soyinka.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?